In this video, we're going to cover the 5 most profitable food businesses for 2024. The typical profit margins in food average 5% to 10%, but on this list, we're only covering the 5 concepts I've consistently seen make more than double the average profit margins by operating at 20% to 35%, meaning their take-home profit can be 4 times more than other food businesses. So, let's dive right into the video. The number 1 most profitable food concept for 2024 is a bubble tea shop. You may have noticed that these are popping up all over the place, and there's a reason for that. They're highly profitable. There's 3 reasons why they're so profitable. The number 1 reason for their profitability is that their cost of goods sold is super low, averaging just 10%. For most restaurants, those costs of food are 30% or more. So bubble tea places are making 3 times more on every order. You're probably wondering, why is that? Because the product that they're selling is basically water, powder, and syrups. All ingredients, by the way, which have a huge shelf life and rarely expire, so there's little food waste involved in that business, continuing to boost the margin. Other major advantages that make it a profitable concept include the fact that the average space requirement is so small, and they can appeal to multiple customer jobs to be done. What I mean by that is that they're not just selling dessert drinks. Some people order less sweet teas as a snack and unsweetened teas as a refreshing beverage. Most bubble tea concepts also serve coffee, making them an alternative for meetings rather than meeting at coffee shops. Bubble tea started in Taiwan in the early 1980s and became very popular throughout Asia. Now, in the 2000s, it's growing like crazy throughout the United States. From a business standpoint, these concepts also require very little upfront cash to open versus most restaurant and cafe concepts. There's no fancy equipment involved, and staff training is easy. The average cost to open from the franchise documents I reviewed was under $200,000 for many of the top bubble tea franchises. Also, it's possible to do it for under $200,000 by doing asset buys of failed coffee shops or tea places. Since so many different types of restaurants get tried and failed, the owners often list them for sale online. They sell their lease, their equipment, and more at a huge discount, even in some cases giving them away for free just to get out of the personal guarantees that they had to sign to open the places. I've seen savvy entrepreneurs open restaurants for under $40,000 using this strategy. They constantly check websites like bizbuysell.com and others so that when a nearby restaurant fails, they take it over and they convert it to their concept for almost no money. This strategy could work for any of the concepts we're covering today. But with most things in business, when there's positives, there's also negatives and trade-offs. So the negatives of a bubble tea concept are that it has become highly competitive in most large cities. The average check is also pretty low compared to most restaurants. Typically, in bubble tea places, it's going to be $15 per customer visit, meaning that you need a high volume of customers to make it work. This is why choosing a highly trafficked location is important for this type of concept. It's an impulse buy and requires a large volume of customers to make work. Speaking of those negatives, there's another highly profitable concept type that is worth mentioning in this video that actually has many of those problems solved. But before we get into that, if you're enjoying this video so far and want more tips on growing a successful restaurant business, then it could be worth clicking that subscribe button down below. Every month, I post new videos on what is working best in restaurants today based on my experience in helping thousands of restaurants grow their sales. Number 2, the health cafe and acai bowls concept. I recently saw the financials behind a health cafe concept in LA that was doing over $1 million in revenue out of a 900 square foot footprint and over $300,000 in profit. I can't share the name of that place because the owners are actually in the process of franchising it. It's working so well and they asked me to keep it private, but I've seen multiple other concepts in this range. These health cafe concepts are usually branded around good health and kindness. Then, when I began researching health cafe concepts, I realized many of the reasons why they tend to work so well. First, health cafes have a shockingly high average check size because consumers of health foods tend to be higher income and used to buying extremely expensive food. The range I've seen for these concepts is $27 on the low end, which is almost double the bubble tea cafe concept, to over $50 average check sizes in high-end communities, meaning that every customer visit is worth twice as much money. in health cafes versus bubble tea concepts. The other great thing is that they offer products which meet a wide set of needs. They service an even bigger group of people than bubble tea places, because they often have some coffee and tea, which is an alternative to coffee shops, as well as some foods which could be perfect for breakfast or lunch or dinner, so they really appeal to many different types of needs that people have every day. Another thing worth noting about healthy concepts is that they tend to attract a higher quality of staff because there's a clear mission built in, making healthy food accessible to their community. A lot of the best entry-level staff tend to be drawn to these types of places and their clientele because of that mission and the types of people that tend to frequent them. The last major benefit they have going for them is they require low capital expenditure to open. I looked at the numbers of many of the top growing franchises in this category, and across the board, it looks like opening costs range from $200,000 to $300,000, which is just slightly more expensive than bubble tea places, but not much given the huge advantage they see in a higher average check size and the easier to attract staff. SaladWorks and Vitality Bowls are two of the fastest growing franchises in the category, which can be opened for $200,000 initial investment and do huge amounts in revenue. There's a huge reason why they've grown to over 70 locations each. One major downside to health cafe concepts, though, is that they have huge amounts of food waste and spoilage if inventory is not purchased properly. The reason being that they sell large amounts of organic and fresh foods, so those can spoil fast if they don't get sold quick. That food waste can drag down profit margin, and the typical food cost I see for these places is typically like 25%, which means lower margin than bubble tea places usually. But of course, it's more expensive to sell fresh organic foods than it is to sell water and powders and syrups like a bubble tea place does. They're still way more profitable on average than the typical restaurants. And the other major downside to health cafes is that the revenue sometimes gets capped as a result of the very small square footage. I've seen operators operating out of 700 square foot places that are busy all day long, and yet they only do $500,000 a year in revenue, which is often less than $100,000 a year in profit, given that these concepts typically operate at about 20% when run well. That actually brings us to the next concept, which is an interesting balance of the first two, yet has its own advantages. But before we get to that, if you're considering opening a specific concept that isn't on this list, feel free to comment your idea down below with what you had in mind, and I'll research the numbers on my end of comparable concepts and get back to you with my thoughts. As you might be able to tell, I'm really passionate about helping new restaurant owners succeed and would love to see what you had in mind in the concepts that you are envisioning opening to see if there's any helpful info that I can share for you. So, on to the next concept. Number 3, the ramen noodles concept. Gourmet ramen noodles have become very popular in the restaurant world lately. They're not just big among broke young people anymore. Multiple types of people seem to love this concept. And there's a few things to love about them as a business too. The benefits start with number 1, a super low food cost. Mostly selling noodles, which are famously very cheap, of course has a low food cost. There's a reason why broke college students live on them. Food costs in ramen places will often be under 10% across the board, even factoring in the meat that they purchase, similar to the bubble tea places. Because it's mostly noodles and seasoning and water that they're selling, with maybe a few pieces of meat and eggs sprinkled in here and there, which they always charge extra for, the food costs are low and controlled. While they have low food costs, they actually have a high average transaction size, because when people tend to order from these places, they're often doing takeout and delivery orders, which are a huge part of their business and often for multiple people. I typically see average check sizes of $40 or more, which is more than double the average transaction size for the bubble tea concept we covered, yet it has a similar profit margin profile, even though it's double the revenue per customer. They appeal to many types and can offer a low entry price point while still having healthy margins. I know I just said that they have high average check sizes, but what I mean by having a low entry price point means that you can get a meal at many ramen places for under $15. The reason the check sizes are so high, even though the average entry price is so low for a single meal, is that people are often ordering for multiple people. It's a very social and popular cuisine type for takeout, and people often order for groups. Bubble tea places and health cafe places are more specific in the types of people who enjoy them. while ramen has very wide appeal. They can appeal to both very healthy eaters as well as more indulgent eaters. Ramen can be made vegan, low carb, and gluten-free and still be very tasty, but can also be made in a very gourmet, indulgent, delicious way. Benefit number 3 is interesting. I would not have expected it if I didn't see the numbers, but people think of going to ramen places kind of like going to a Japanese restaurant. So they have the highest average check size and the highest tips on this list. They even have tips on takeout orders that are really high. The average I see is 15% on takeout orders and like 20% in-house. You might be wondering, Adam, why would an owner care what the tips are? Well, because the staff really does. It supplements their wage and it helps you retain them for as long as possible and keep them happy. Some of the best restaurant staff I've met before have been at ramen places. And the reason is that people tip like they're going to a sushi restaurant, but the food costs to the restaurant are so much lower, so they can often afford to attract the best staff through a combination of high wages and high tips. Benefit number 4 is that there is extremely high revenue potential. The fast serve nature of ramen means that tables turn fast, even though there's a high check size. And ramen businesses always have a huge portion of their business going through takeout, meaning they can constantly operate their kitchens at full capacity, even while their dining room is also full. And benefit number 5 is that they have very low food waste. Noodles have an extremely long shelf life, which means that even fresh ramen can be stored for weeks before it goes bad. So inventory is so much easier to manage if there's big spikes in demand or big drops in demand. So these benefits all sound awesome, right? What are the negatives? Number 1 is that it's the most expensive to open on this list. You'll need more than 1,000 square feet, typically between 1,500 and 2,000, and those real estate costs can eat into margin. There's also specialized equipment to buy to make ramen. Upfront costs for a ramen place will be a minimum of $250,000, but I've seen them go up to $1 million for a super high-end build-out. The number 2 drawback is that it actually requires a lot of skill to make a gourmet ramen. It's a lot more than just putting the instant noodles in the microwave. It's not like making bubble tea or putting a healthy salad together in the cafe. Gourmet ramen isn't instant noodles type thing where you just put it in the microwave and it's ready. It's almost like being a sushi chef to get the quality really good. Ramen chefs require deep training and expertise, so it requires paying more in labor in the kitchen and often learning new skills as the owner to quality control. The number 3 negative is that it's starting to become highly competitive in large cities. I think small to mid-sized towns are still pretty unsaturated with ramen concepts, but cities like New York and LA have hundreds at this point. They also appeal to people way more in urban and suburban areas than concepts like health cafes, which can work just as well in rural towns. Speaking of competition, there's another concept which is similar to ramen places, but that has less competition in big cities today. It's kind of like a mix between a health cafe and a ramen place. And that's number 4 on the list, poke restaurants. Poke shops specialize in a form of food from Hawaii called poke bowls. You can think of them kind of like a salad with sushi ingredients, fresh raw fish over greens. It's similar to sushi, but it's actually healthier and requires less skill to make. The major business advantages to poke shops are that they're 1, still uncompetitive in most markets. They're a new and rapidly growing concept, but they haven't been saturated in most markets. 2, they have a very quickly growing market. Just 15 years ago, they were a $0 billion industry. Now it's over $1 billion and growing over 10% every year. Poke started in Hawaii, but has been spreading like wildfire in this country over the past 20 years. It's super healthy, on-trend food. As we covered before, that tends to attract better staff through mission. They also have extremely high average check sizes. The reason is that poke shops are selling fresh fish, which people have a high willingness to pay for. The average check size for poke shops is almost always over $40, even though they're almost always counter service concepts. Number 4 is the super low labor cost compared to check size. Poke bowls are extremely fast and easy to make, and you can literally be operating a poke concept with the same footprint as a Subway shop. 1 to 2 employees at the counter preparing the food in the line is all it takes. Number 5 is fast table turn. People are often in and out of the restaurant within 20 minutes. This, paired with the low labor cost and high average check size, makes them extremely effective in high foot traffic areas because people walk in, they spend a lot of money, and then they walk out within 20 minutes, making room for the next people. But there's 2 major negatives to poke restaurants that are worth covering. The first is more difficult quality control. Because they're selling fresh, raw fish, they have to stay on top of the quality of it, or it could lead to bad customer experiences like food poisoning. The second is quick to spoil ingredients. Fresh fish needs to be bought and sold very quickly. So if poke shops don't operate with very careful inventory controls, they can have a lot of spoilage which eats into their food costs. Even with those disadvantages, I think poke restaurants are a great bet and a great concept. They get super high average check sizes, require small amounts of square footage to open, often under 1,000 square feet and less than $200,000, and they also operate at over 20% margins. More than double the usual restaurant margins, as long as they get their inventory dialed in and quickly get ramped up to capacity. Because they turn tables so much faster than the other concepts on this list, they can make over $1 million a year in revenue, even with that very small square footage. So that brings us to number 5 on the list, which is the most unlike the others that we've covered in this video, but is still highly profitable. And that is number 5, ice cream shops. The key advantages to ice cream shops compared to everything else on this list are actually threefold. First, they service an absolutely huge market, the biggest on this list by far, because most of the profitable concepts on this list tend to appeal to a small niche. But ice cream is different. The average American eats roughly 20 pounds of ice cream every year, and over 80% of Americans eat it multiple times per month. Second, they have low food cost, which means low cost of goods sold. The average I see in ice cream shops is 15% food costs, which is similar in profile to the bubble tea shop we covered. Third, they require extremely low skill to operate, arguably the lowest skill of all. That means hiring and training staff is easy and uncomplicated, and you basically just need 2 people at the counter. But there are major negatives to ice cream shops. First, they're highly competitive. Because ice cream shops have been so profitable for so long, they've popped up everywhere. The good news is that there's lots of competition, but very few ice cream shops have actually differentiated themselves. The best that I've seen at differentiating is Salt and Straw, a concept that is taking over the West Coast. What they do is they constantly bring in new and wacky flavors. They make flavors like salty donut and olive oil, which people love to experience and then quickly share with their friends and on social media because they're so unique. If I were opening an ice cream shop today, I would basically copy Salt and Straw's strategy to differentiate and bring it into a market where they're not going because it has proven to be so successful, and yet there's only 36 locations in the US today. All 36 locations, by the way, have lines out the door every day and are probably doing over $1 million a year with 20% profit margins in a small 1,000 square foot space. If I were to estimate based on the publicly available data about ice cream shops and just how busy Salt and Straw is, I would guess that they're averaging $200,000 a year in profit on locations that cost less than $500,000 to open all in, which is considered to be very, very good in this world. Second, ice cream shops can be highly seasonal, especially in markets where it gets very cold. People buy ice cream like crazy in the summer, but not nearly as much when it's freezing cold outside. To solve this problem, I've often seen ice cream concepts serve other treats which appeal in winter months, like warm bubble tea and gourmet fresh-baked cookies. Frozen yogurt shops were super trendy for a decade, and at one point looked like they were going to compete with and disrupt ice cream shops. But then they fell out of trend, and many businesses in that world got absolutely crushed as frozen yogurt sales have been declining. But ice cream has stayed a top 5 most popular dessert in America for the past 50 years for a reason. And breakout success, like we saw with Salt and Straw, proves that there's still room in the market if you can do it better. If you enjoyed this video on the most profitable food and beverage businesses you can open, then you would also really benefit from the video that I made on why restaurants fail, where I talk about all of the non-obvious reasons why restaurants ultimately don't work out. I'll put it to the right of me here that you can click into and check out so that you can click right from this video into that one.